Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Elan Journo. I'm Director of Policy Research at the Ayn Rand Institute. 10 years have passed since the horrific Tuesday morning. 10 years since those attacks on New York and Washington shocked and angered our nation. What lessons have we as Americans learned in that time? What lessons have we failed to learn? With two unresolved wars and with the Middle East in upheaval, how should we evaluate American policy in this time? And how will those rebellions and protests in that part of the world, from Tunisia to Syria and elsewhere, how will they impact America's vital interests? And what lies ahead for the United States and its relationship with Israel, with a soon-to-be nuclear-capable Iran? These are some of the urgent questions that we'll be exploring today in our three panels. Our project is to survey the scene, assess the record of American policy, and look forward to what we should be doing going into the future, drawing lessons from the past and looking forward. For today's event, we have brought together a distinguished group of speakers for our discussion. And they represent a range of viewpoints, and I'm eager to hear their thoughts on questions before us today. This symposium is sponsored by the Ayn Rand Institute's public policy arm, the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights. Let me just say a word about who we are. The Ayn Rand Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1985, and our mission, reflected in our broad range of activities, is to foster a growing awareness and understanding of Ayn Rand's philosophic works and her philosophy of objectivism. Our aim is to foster a different kind of culture, one whose guiding principles are reason, rational self-interest, and a laissez-faire capitalist society. Put a different way, our vision is to bring about a culture in which individuals are free to pursue their own happiness, in the same view, in the same terms as the Founding Fathers. And it is these distinctively American ideals that inform our work in domestic and foreign policy. So our agenda for today begins with a panel discussion on the upheavals in the Middle East. Following that, we will turn to a discussion of the Islamist threat. And our final panel is titled Iran, Israel, and the West. Let me add that right after that final panel, there will be reception with refreshments, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that. We are today, through the genius of the internet, joined by a global audience of people watching a live stream of this video, and to you across the internet, welcome as well. A few quick housekeeping points. Now is the time, if you haven't already done so, to deactivate, turn off, and silence your cell phones. I know you don't want to be the one whose cell phone interrupts the discussion. And let me just say a word of thanks to my colleagues at the Ayn Rand Institute for helping put this event together, particularly Lynn Zinzer and Anu Sepala, along with our entire outreach and marketing team. Let me also thank the sponsors and supporters, contributors to the Ayn Rand Institute for making our work possible. And finally, the Corette Foundation for their generous support of this event. Let me introduce our panelists for the first event. On the far end of the table, to my left, though not politically to my left, is Yaron Brook. He is president of the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights. He is a columnist at Forbes.com, and his articles have been featured in major publications. Dr. Brook is often interviewed on radio and television, and he's a guest on a variety of national TV programs. He is the co-author of Neoconservatism, An Obituary for an Idea, and the contributor to Winning the Unwinnable War, America's Self-Crippled Response to Islamic Totalitarianism. Dr. Brook is a former finance professor. He is an internationally sought-after speaker on such topics as the causes of the financial crisis, the morality of capitalism, and U.S. foreign policy. Dr. Brook was born and raised in Israel. He served as a first sergeant in the Israeli military intelligence and earned a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the Technion Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa. He received an MBA and PhD in finance from the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for joining us today, Yaron. Next to him is Professor Walid Phares. He serves as an advisor to the Anti-Terrorism Caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives and a co-secretary general the Transatlantic Legislative Group on Counter-Terrorism, a Euro-American Caucus since 2009. Dr. Phares briefs and testifies to the US Congress, the European Parliament, and the United Nations Security Council on matters related to international security and the Middle East conflict. He consults with and lectures to several national security and defense agencies, as well as to counter-terrorism advisory boards in North America and Europe. He has served on the advisory board of the Task Force on Future Terrorism, the Department of Homeland Security 2006-7, as well as on the Advisory Task Force on Nuclear Terrorism 2007. He teaches global strategies at the National Defense University since 2006. Previously, he was a professor at Middle East Studies and Comparative Politics at Florida Atlantic University. He has published several books in English, Arabic, and French, including the latest 3 post-9/11 volumes, Future Jihad, Terrorist Strategies Against the West, The War of Ideas, Jihadism Against Democracy, and The Confrontation, Winning the War Against Future Jihad. His most recent timely book, published December of last year, is The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East, which has projected the uprising in the region before they occur. Dr. Phares is a Fox News Channel Middle East and terrorism expert. He has served as NBC terrorism analyst until 2006, and he appears on international and Arab media and is published widely. Welcome and thank you. Efraim Karsh is director of the Middle East Forum, editor of the Middle East Quarterly, the forum's flagship publication, and professor of Middle East and Mediterranean Studies at King's College London. He has held various academic posts at Harvard and Columbia Universities, the Sorbonne, the London School of Economics, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies in Washington, D.C., and the Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies at Tel Aviv University. Dr. Karsh is the author of 15 books. He has appeared as a commentator on all the main British and American television networks, and he has contributed over 100 articles to leading newspapers and magazines. Thank you, welcome. Finally, Daniel Pipes. He's one of the world's foremost analysts on the Middle East and Islam. He is director of, I guess now president of the Middle East Forum, a nonprofit organization founded in 1994 whose slogan is Promoting American Interests. A few points that make Daniel Pipes stand out. His influence on public debate is widely acknowledged. The Wall Street Journal, for example, said of him, he's an authoritative commentator on the Middle East. The Boston Globe, if Pipes' admonitions had been heeded, there might never have been a 9/11. He's a graduate of Harvard University with a BA and PhD in history. He has been recognized as one of Harvard's 100 most influential living graduates. He's taught at many universities, including Harvard, Princeton, Chicago, the U.S. Naval War College, and Pepperdine. He's a prize-winning columnist, formerly for the New York Times Syndicate, and now writing independently for many years in many newspapers. His website, danielpipes.org, is among the most accessed sources of specialized information on the Middle East and Islam. He has many statements foreshadowing what is to come, and I'll give you just one of these. In 1995, he wrote about radical Islam. Quote, unnoticed by most Westerners, war has been unilaterally declared on Europe and the United States. Thank you and welcome. So let's turn to our first topic. The format for the panels will be that each of the speakers will give a brief presentation, and then we'll turn to questions from me and from you in the audience and turn it into a conversation. Though when you do ask a question, I ask that it is a question, not a comment, and I'll stop you if you make a comment, try to reorient it. So let's begin with you, Dr. Pipes. Why don't you set the scene for us with the upheavals in the Middle East?
Thank you, Dr. Journo, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You are the beneficiaries of 9 countries in 8 minutes. So I was given 8 minutes, but there are a lot of countries. So lots is going on. In retrospect, to look at the first 2, Tunisia and Egypt, the reasons why things moved so quickly in January and February of this year is that these were coups d'etat, not revolutions. In other words, in both cases, the security apparatus in Tunisia, the military leadership in Egypt, said to their respective presidents, Ben Ali and Mubarak, go. You're too expensive, you're too unpopular, your families are rapacious, we don't need you anymore. They took advantage, the security establishment, military establishment, took advantage of the street demonstrations to get rid of their leaders. The important implication of this is that nothing much has changed. It's still basically the same people in charge. Yes, Mohammed al-Tantawi in Egypt is different from Hosni Mubarak, different person, different aspirations, different personality, but fundamentally he's head of the same military institution that Mubarak was, and therefore one sees much more continuity than change. And secondly, the liberals who are on the streets of Tahrir Square, the Islamists who are lurking in the background, really don't have any more power now than they did before. Yes, the government will pay them perhaps more attention. Yes, they'll have the presidency, but really, in fact, nothing much has changed. These were coups d'etat, not revolutions. In contrast, third country, Libya, there was a civil war, still a little bit going on, and there is a complete change of institutional personnel and ideology in Libya. The problem is we don't know who's coming next. NATO supported the rebels in Benghazi without having any idea who they are. And as time goes on, we are finding out that they're not a completely salubrious group. How things will turn out, because they're pretty much on their own, Western influence is modest at best, we don't know. We have supported a group that was against this foul, eccentric dictator. With luck, they will be better, but they could well be worse, and that he was an isolated dictator, and these could be Islamists who take over, who are connected to the larger Islamist movement and could do more damage to Libya even than Gaddafi, and more damage internationally. So it's a throw of the dice in Libya. We don't know. Yemen, I see, fourth country, as the potentially most disastrous situation, in that the Yemeni situation is dominated by so many different contending forces: geographic, ideological, ethnic, religious, political, tribal. It's hard to see a government forming that controls the country. It's hard to see how the extreme economic and ecological problems of the country be dealt with. I worry about humanitarian disaster. I also worry about the problems of Yemen being exported, not just locally, but internationally. One has substantial numbers of refugees turning up without skills and creating problems around the world. Fifth, Syria. Syria is, I think, the great opportunity for the West, because in my view, the devil we don't know in Syria is better than the devil we do. And that strategically, the most important thing about Syria is not what's taking place within Syria, but the Syrian connection to Iran. Iran is the most important threat in the Middle East. Syria is a very powerful asset of Iran. If the government of the Assad dynasty falls, then I think one can predict with considerable certainty that any successor government, whatever its nature, will break that 30-year alliance with Iran, and that is the most important thing from our point of view. There can be all sorts of troubles along the way, of course, but I think in this case we want to change. I would say that any government that succeeds is better than the government that's there, because any government will be full of anger at the Iranians for what they have been doing these last 30 years, and particularly during this year, when they seem to have been heavily involved in the suppression of the rebellion. Sixth country, Turkey. Turkey doesn't have a rebellion, but Turkey, I think, has gone through a profound change just a few weeks ago. The 28th of July, 4 out of 5 of the chiefs of staff of Turkey resigned. The 5th became the head of the military. This was a symbolic gesture by which it looks like the military said, we give up. You, the civilians, are in charge. Now, from an American point of view, this is good news. We'd like having civilians in charge. But in Turkey, things are more complex. The military has been, for 70 years, the keepers of Ataturk's secular flame, and their demise as a political force just some weeks ago means that now the Islamists who run the government also run the whole country, and that the challenge that they faced of the military saying no to them and overturning them is now defunct. Or to put it in more dramatic terms, the secular republic that Mustafa Ataturk founded, Kemal Ataturk founded in 1923, is defunct, and now it's the second, it's now the second Turkish Republic of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is the prime minister and presumably, eventually, the president of Turkey. A profound change has taken place in Turkey, and a change from our point of view that is entirely negative. 7th and 8th countries are Iraq and Afghanistan. I believe it was the right thing to do in 2001 to extirpate the Taliban, and in 2003 to extirpate Saddam Hussein. I think it was a mistake for US-led forces to then try to rehabilitate these two countries and to make them into free and independent and market economies. The circumstances were not right for that. We have now spent huge amounts of money, $1 trillion in Iraq, a third that much money in Afghanistan, 5,000 lives in Iraq, a third that many in Afghanistan. Huge investment. And I believe, I predict, that as American troops leave, that investment will evaporate. And then within, say, 5-10 years, you will not see many traces of all the efforts we have made. I also predict that those troops aren't really going to leave until after the U.S. national elections in 15, 16 months from now. Because should they leave on schedule at the end of 2011 and mid-2012, there's a greater danger that the regimes who put in those two countries will collapse. And that will not look good on election day. So I think that there will be a lingering American presence for some time, but in the long term, there will be no significant American accomplishment. And finally, Iran. Iran is the most important country in the region. It is the one that threatens, the one that seeks to destabilize. It is the most anti-Western. It's building nuclear weapons. It has the terrorist infrastructure. It has an ideology that it's flogging. Iran is also potentially the good news, because the Iranian government, however strong and bellicose, is hollow, and that the great majority of the Iranian people are fed up with this ideology and this system and want something else. Iran is the one country which is somewhat analogous to the Soviet bloc in the old days, where the government is hostile, but the people are friendly. Nowhere else. It is the one place where we can see the potential of cooperation with the population in a post-Islamic Republic regime. It's not easy to get there, but that should be our goal, and I think it is feasible because there is such antagonism towards the existing regime.
Thank you. Dr. Karsh.
Well, to speak after Dr. Pipes, it's a big challenge. So what I'll do, I'll take it from a different perspective, you know. I used to be an intelligence officer in my first incarnation in the Israeli army, and then when I began and embarked on an academic career, I prefer to be a historian, because I think it's more solid, and nobody can come to me and say, why didn't you see this and that coming? So at least in this respect, I feel quite safe and secure. If we look at the Middle East over the past 100 years or so, there have been two major upheavals until now. I mean, the major one was, of course, in the wake of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the present state system was established on its ruins. And the collapse of the Ottoman Empire symbolized much more than the fall of one empire, but rather the collapse of a political, religious order that dominated the Middle East for 1,300 years. And the ideal that on which it was predicated survived, outlived the Ottoman Empire. It's what I personally call the Islamic imperial dream. So the Ottoman Empire collapsed, but there are others, competitors, that hurried to fill the void. Some of them were dynasties, the Hashemites, who established later Iraq and Jordan. They wanted the entire Middle East. They were forced to content themselves with these two. There are other non-governmental organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood that was established in 1928 and sought to re-establish the order that existed since the rise of Muhammad, and this organization is still active. Turkey, by definition, which was at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, went in the direction of a nation state. Dr. Parks mentioned it. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk took Turkey and extricated it from its imperial path. And since the imperial past was inextricably linked with Islam, he made Turkey basically based on a secular, pseudo-Western political order. And this political order survived and still exists in many ways. The second major upheaval happened about 40 years later, in the late 40s, early 50s, or even mid-late 50s. From the late 40s to the late 50s, you could say that the trigger was the Palestine 48 war, in a way the second most important event since the collapse, or the most important event since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and the results, the establishment of the State of Israel and the defeat of a number of Arab states, created upheavals in the Arab world. Jordan's king, for example, was assassinated. The Egyptian monarchy was overthrown, which is fundamentally bigger change than what happened now, which is basically the same regime state. Only a person left. In the late 50s, the Hashemite kingdom in Iraq was overthrown. In the early 50s, there was development in Iran towards a different, I don't know if more democratic regime, but the American intervened, the so-called Mossadegh era. So the 50s, Syria was rocked by a number of coup d'etats, and since then has been an unstable state for over a decade. So we had the fall of the Ottoman Empire, we had the 50s, and now we have the third wave, if you like. And as I said, as a historian, I'm still quite cautious in pronouncing my judgment. The jury is still out. But so far, as we can see, I agree with Dr. Pipe that in Egypt and Tunisia, it has been basically a coup d'etat at the moment, but then again, it set free forces that may eventually take over. The Muslim Brothers who were established, as I mentioned, already 80 or 90 years ago, are now the foremost force in the Middle East, that they may take over. The most important, perhaps, development, as Dr. Pipes mentioned, is probably Turkey, where we see the demise of Turkey's republic established by Mustafa Kemal. But on the other hand, Turkey is moving not in the direction of republic, in my view, but in the direction, if you would like to call it, people call it already Ottoman, but I would call it maybe the young Turks, the people who dominated Turkish politics or Ottoman politics just before the World War I and led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So they're not going really in the direction of republic, they're going in the direction of an Islamic entity which transcends the normal boundaries of nation state. As for Syria, I personally don't know if it's good or bad, we can discuss it later. I mean, the last time that an Assad president fought against the opposition, which was in the 1980s, it was basically based on Muslim Brotherhood. So I don't know which type the opposition is today, but I won't rule out that if the Assad regime falls, it will usher the way to a Muslim or the Islamist, as we call it, regime, and the same in Libya. I mean, when the Libyan events began, I mean, they would have ended quite quickly, and the West not intervened. But when they began, I was in London, I was watching Sky Television, which I find quite difficult to get here, but they're covering the events all the time and talking about liberal, westernized, but then, the correspondent is standing among huge amount of people, all of them praying, their faces on the ground, then they shout Allah Akbar all the time, and then it tells us that these are westernized people looking for a western-type democracy. So I personally tend to doubt it. But as I said, I'll reserve judgment of it, and I'll be happy to elaborate with the question.
I'd like to thank the Institute for extending the invitation, and thank you for coordinating. Thank you for being here. What I would like to try to do in, again, 8 minutes is to answer, or try to answer 2 questions. The first one is there a link, historical link between 9/11, between the event that we are commemorating this week, and the Arab Spring, which I tried to establish the base of in my latest book. And second question, an attempt to an early identification of the forces of the Arab Spring. Because I do argue that the Arab Spring is not monolithic. It is multi-dimensional. It has multiple forces, and therefore, a good approach with the understanding of these forces could give us some notion of how to project. I would never use the term predict, but project events into the future. As we heard from historians and, of course, serious analysts on the issue, what preceded what I call the genome of the Arab Spring in the 20th century, and specifically in the decade before 9/11, are two significant dynamics that are very revealing with regard to what caused the Arab Spring or the forces that were successful in at least overthrowing the regimes, all kinds of regimes, pro-American regimes, anti-American regimes, and regimes in between. First of all, a quick look at the 20th century. We would see that under British and French mandates, and then post-1945, throughout the Cold War, under the Arab League regime, at least for the Arab countries, the same forces that actually organized and rose in the Arab Spring have tried to do so before. The same forces, for example, if you look at Egypt, you have the Muslim Brotherhood tried many times to have a spring or to have a coup or to have a change in Egypt, and they were harshly repressed. They became experts in being repressed and therefore are now the experts in penetrating societies and having a long-term resistance against the suppression of governments. Liberal forces are not new. Individuals, authors who have tried in the Arab world to play the reformist card. We have the writings, we have tons of books and articles. So these forces are not new. This is a new generation of these forces. But what we conclude with here, first point, that in the 20th century, despite those attempts on both sides, the Islamists and the non-Islamists, they were not successful. One of the reasons, plenty of reasons, but one of the reasons was the fact that there was a Cold War. And in a Cold War, everything is frozen outside the Cold War, meaning neither the Soviet Union nor the NATO or the Western bloc have been really significantly interested in having changes that would go against their immediate interests. The Soviets wanted their own regimes to stay as such. So in Syria, for example, they did back the Assad regime, the Ba'ath regime, against all the uprisings which were organized by the Muslim Brotherhood at the time. And in pro-Western countries, the United States and the international coalition of the US were interested in keeping those regimes versus even the liberals or the Muslim Brotherhood or others. Then the Cold War ended. Same parameters continued in the 90s, the pre-9/11 decade and post-Cold War decade, which were the 90s. Those same forces tried again. In some cases, they were a little bit more successful, but yet were not able to achieve what was achieved since January of 2011. It's because of many other reasons, including almost the same reason, one of which was stability. US foreign policy, Western foreign policy was in the region oil inclined. So any major change in those countries, and by the way, the same United States, when there were threats on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood against the Mubarak regime or Ben Ali or others, had the same position that we stick with our allies. So that brings us to 9/11. What did change basically in 9/11? Not the actual forces, the international context, the alignment of planets on the one hand. And on the other hand, of course, the tools. What was not there before 9/11, or at least the same time period, was the massive rise of internet, of communications. And let's not forget, that brought about a lot of dynamics to those who wanted to rise. 9/11 by itself didn't have an impact. What followed 9/11, in my sense, the Western intervention in the region, similarly to the story of Western intervention in the late 19th century in the region, had some consequences, effects. And if you visit quickly, first was the downfall of the Taliban. That's at the edge of the Middle East. But what came after the Taliban, sociologically speaking, was instead of one Islamist authoritarian regime, you had multiple political parties. You have a very mediocre democracy, obviously, and a lot of mismanagement by the government. But put this on the side. What the public has been seeing in Afghanistan is the fact that you can have multiple voices, you can have debates. That was the first message that was sent. The second message, probably more important, despite our debate in Washington about the Iraq invasion. That's something else. What came after the Iraq invasion was the fact that instead of one Ba'ath party, there were 120 political parties, most of which were not really democratic, but the fact that there were parliaments and there were messaging, and there were different kind of political expressions, and more important probably, 120 newsletters, publications, satellite TV. The ambiance in the region has changed, definitely after the fall of Saddam Hussein, and that communicate to other societies, to the segments in other societies, both the Islamists, but also the liberals and the democratic forces, some sort of energy. First thought, which basically was, I consider, one of the ancestors of civil society moving, regardless of the regional context, was Beirut, the Cedars Revolution, 2005. The SMS revolution, where 1.5 million people, and that's not an armed movement or a small-sized demonstration, that's almost the entire government or the entire society moving. And the result of that was the departure of the Syrian army of Lebanon. It did not end the problem in Lebanon. Hezbollah is still armed in Lebanon, but it's the actual Cedars Revolution that inspired others, again, via internet, via Facebook, via YouTube at the time. 2 years later, or actually 4 years later, June of 2009, for the first time ever since 1979, this is significant, 1.5 million people demonstrated in the streets of Tehran, the Green Revolution. Now, it was not successful, that is not the issue. What it did, basically, Beirut and Tehran sent a message to others. How do we know? By reading simply online resources. How Arab performers and Arab Facebookers started to say, well, look, it was possible to put 1 million people, and that cannot be ignored, and we could actually do the same. But the Islamists also looked at the same phenomenon. So now quickly, Tunisia, Egypt, and the rest of the Arab countries that got involved as at the beginning of this year in what we call now the Arab Spring, was a mixture of a rise. The rise essentially, in my sense, is the rise of civil society. And I just made the point that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists have tried before and failed. And the liberal Democrats, NGOs and what have you, also tried before. They ended up in prison, exile, or beyond. So what happened this time differently, for example, at least in Egypt, if we take it as an example quickly, is that in the first few days of that revolt, what did we have? We had a Facebook with 85,000 hits. That was not, omnipresent in Syria or in Egypt in the 80s. And the first thousands of people who took to the streets were people from the Facebook. And already by saying Facebook, you're putting your face in front of the threat. That's different. Now, when civil society in Egypt, if I'm going to do a quick 30 seconds microcosm analysis, those who took to the streets first were middle class, were labor unions, were all sorts of popular organizations. And it's only at the end of that week that the Muslim Brotherhood were in the back. It's like a few divisions sitting in the back and negotiating among their own leadership, should we go in or not, should we send the students in? Of course they knew that this was a window, an opening. And the alignment of planets that most analysts are looking at in Egypt is the fact that the international community, because of the visibility of what was happening, including in the United States and Europe, could not ignore it. So it's true that the US and the West actually told Mubarak not to send in the armed forces. That opened the window to the armed forces basically to become the strongest element. Now, when the Tahrir Square revolt continued for a few more weeks, the equation was very simple. It was the armed forces, as Dr. Pines has mentioned, that decided that it's time for Mubarak to go. But they couldn't have done it before. So it could have been a pure coup had they rolled with their tanks into the palaces. In fact, it was a sort of a coup mounted on a revolt which did not become a revolution. Because the Muslim Brotherhood immediately took to the streets, are the most organized, although numerically are lesser than the wider society. So let me move out immediately from the micro-analysis and then project this into the other places without going into the details. Same goes for Tunisia with different measurements. The army flipped, but only after the civil society rose. Libya, I agree that the beginning was demonstrations, but those demonstrations immediately turned into, as was said, civil war. But quickly also one would have to mention that the most organized in Libya, and I am making this statement because in Washington and in Brussels there's always the question, we don't know them. Well, we know a little bit more about them. It's not that we don't know them. We know those forces. And we don't need Sky News. We have Al Jazeera that goes in every day, every hour, interview every single one of the commanders. And by now, even, respectable networks are calling them Islamist. By yesterday, the day before yesterday on BBC, they were called Islamist forces. So yes, in Libya, the dominant force on the ground, other than the bureaucrats and the former diplomats who are the TNC leaders, are basically the Islamist militias on the ground. And we could discuss what would be the projections for Libya later. Syria, I would surmise, it's the same type of equation with different dimensions. The Muslim Brotherhood certainly are the most organized, but they're not alone. In the 80s, yes, they were the only ones. They were repressed. Now they are with others. How will that move? It will also be linked to how much the Iranians and Hezbollah will support this regime. I wouldn't visit Turkey because it has been covered significantly. I would just mention that in the final analysis, the Islamists may, at some point in time, depending on how the West is going to move. That's a very important component that could change things. If the West, led by the United States, is going to partner, and I underline partner and I will explain it later, with the Muslim Brotherhood, considering them as the new occupiers of the region, then they will take over. They have everything with them. If we're going to release the funds of the G20, the $40 billion, to the forthcoming governments in those places, of course, it's going to be the Muslim Brotherhood takeover. My projection is, if that is the case, you're going to get Islamist governments and states. But you're going to also get a renewal of a second wave of civil society rise, meaning, unlike in Iran in 1979, where the Khomeinis took over and then there was another many decades before the Green Revolution would move up again, I do project that if the Islamists will take and seize, because they are under international scrutiny, I think that civil society would rise against them. That would be not for the next weeks, for the next months, but people are tired of authoritarians. And even if the Muslim Brotherhoods or their cousins in the region are going to try to tighten and do a Taliban-like soft way, they will face off with civil society. If the West does something else, which I don't see happening in the next couple of years, that is to partner with civil society forces in the region, then there may be a shot at an interim time whereby those civil society forces and the Muslim Brotherhood will vie democratically and politically and may move the region into what I call mediocre democracies. What we may move into if we don't help civil society is non-democracies. So the choice, and I conclude, is going to be non-democracies or mediocre democracies. Thank you.
Thank you. So what makes what's happened this last spring in the Arab world interesting is, of course, the potential for the rise of what might be called civil society, or might be called, a truly, true liberty in the Middle East, something that we've never really seen in the Middle East. The notion that I think much of the mainstream media, many of the commentators out there would like us to believe, is that the uprisings, the demonstrations are basically led by freedom-loving, Western types who would bring about a true birth of freedom and liberty in the Middle East. And if that's true, wow, that is truthfully a earth-shattering event. On the other hand, if all we're seeing is a transition from one form of despotism to potentially a much worse form of despotism, or to a status quo, which is what Dr. Pipe suggests is happening in Egypt and Tunisia, at least, a kind of from one military ruler to another military ruler, then one is kind of we're neutral to, and of course the last one is horrific, because that would suggest an even worse environment for the West, for the US, for Israel, for the values that we care about. So how do we assess which direction the Middle East is going to be heading towards? I think it's important to maybe step back and say, well, what are the requirements? And of course, historians and thinkers will be thinking about this for hundreds of years. What are the requirements for the establishment of freedom, of liberty, of the kind of societies that we, unfortunately, in the West take for granted, for the life we have here in the United States, even for Europe, which we look down on, but hey, they're free, relative to human history, and relative to the rest of the world, they're doing great. Or even to many of the newer countries, the newer liberal countries in Asia. And I would argue that there are two fundamental ideas that a culture at some level or another have to adopt in order for freedom and liberty to be successful. And the two are secularism and individualism, to some extent. Now, what do I mean by secularism? I don't mean by secularism that everybody has to become an atheist or an agnostic. What I mean by secularism is that there is an understanding that the role of religion, to the extent that it exists, is in the home, in the church or the mosque, but it is not in politics. That is the separation of church and state. I think that was an essential, fundamental to the revolution that happened in this country, and it was a necessary fundamental revolution in Europe. And I think to the extent that Turkey, up until this latest government, has been a successful state, it was fundamental. Ataturk's great achievement was the separation. He did it through violence and not through the intellect or through a change, a philosophical change, and that's why I don't think it'll last, but through a violent change, the violent separation of church from state. So secularism, in a sense of separation of church and state. And individualism, that is a rejection of the notion that has existed throughout most of human history, that we as individuals belong to fill in the blank. The state, the tribe, the religious, whatever, the religious leader, some other entity other than self-ownership, in a sense. This is, again, the essential characteristic of the American Revolution. This was the first country in history established on the notion that our lives as individuals belong to us, not to the state, not to the tribe, not to any kind of group, not to any kind of other authority. That's what individual rights, that's where they come from. They come from the fact that we are autonomous human beings. We are autonomous. Our life is our own. So the question, I would pose is, has the Middle East changed? That is, I think everybody would acknowledge that in the past, the Middle East has been dominated by tribalism, collectivism, and religion. And a religion that's all-encompassing. Even in these states which are not religious, like Egypt, Syria, the mentality is religious in the sense that religion is used by the state, but the mentality of religion qua obedience is used extensively. That is, the populace is not expected to question. So has any of those changed? Have these cultures become less tribal, less collectivistic, less religious in this all-encompassing sense? Has there been an increase, a significant increase in respect for science, for reason, for the value of the individual qua individual? Now, I agree that there have always been elements of secularism and individualism in these countries. There's certainly a liberal in the 19th century, positive sense, right? There's been a liberal element within Egypt, certainly. We've read their authors, and there's been significant liberal literature out of there. Certainly there were liberal elements in Lebanon and in Syria. But has that really grown to a point where it is a substantial force within society? And I would suggest that the answer is no. That these cultures have not changed fundamentally. If anything, have become more religious and become more committed to an Islamist agenda. The Muslim Brotherhood is a horrific force, an Islamist force. It's probably the most powerful and most organized force in the Middle East today. It is astounding to me that in Egypt there's actually a significant political force that is more extreme than the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafites. And I saw it just, it was, I think, a month or two, and it got almost no play in the general media, but there was a massive demonstration in Cairo, the largest demonstration since the original series of demonstrations. Hundreds of thousands of people, all Salafites, all, the whole demonstration was basically a series of prayers and a series of attacks against Israel and against the West. It was scary to watch, the little television coverage that was provided. You basically saw hundreds of thousands of people dressed the same, all groveling all on their knees. That, I think, is much more the face, the evolving face of the Middle East than is the idea of secularism, individualism, Western ideologies, liberalism. And I fear that what is being seeded right now, let's even pretend, let's even assume, and it might happen that you get elections in Egypt and the military really steps back, but I think it's very unlikely that that'll happen. They're too interwound into Egyptian society, and there's too much wealth there for them to walk away from. But let's assume that you have elections. The likely winners of those elections are the religious parties, the Muslim Brotherhoods and WUS. And look, it doesn't take much of a vote to control government. We've learned that in Lebanon. The Hezbollah has no more than 20% of the vote in Lebanon, probably less than that. And yet the Hezbollah controls politics in Lebanon. Why? It holds them all high ground, and they're willing to die for their cause. They are radicals. They really believe in something. Do the liberals in Lebanon really believe in something? Are they willing to risk their lives for it, to really fight for something? No. We've seen that. They're just not. There is no competing ideology today, I don't think, at least in terms of consistency, in terms of passion, to the ideology of Islamism. Unfortunately, and this goes to the West, and the West's role, I don't think there's a competing ideology in the West. I think we're kind of so wishy-washy with regard to what we believe in. It's hard to see in the Middle East a Western ideology that is held more passionately than we will even hold it in the West today. So unfortunately, I'm quite pessimistic about where this is all heading. I think the model is at Lebanon, and I think the model is the Palestinian Authority, where when granted democracy, they voted overwhelmingly for the Hamas. And since then, there have been no election. And if there were elections tomorrow, I don't doubt the fact that Hamas would win again, or some party as radical as Hamas. I fear that that is the direction the Middle East is heading. Thank you.
We'll take questions in a moment. I want to take the prerogative of the moderator to put a few to you in the panel. You just sounded pessimistic, and it sounds like if we agree that it's not a monolithic phenomenon, I'm interested in your views, and we'll go through each person, of what are the risks, and putting this in a broader context of it, the tag or the name for this has been conventionally agreed upon as the Arab Spring, but I sense that there's more to it than a semantic issue, that there's more. Is that an accurate definition? And in terms of where are the greatest risks, how would you assess that? So why don't we start here?
I've never used the term Arab Spring. First of all, it's climatically inaccurate in that the key events were in fall of last year, winter of this year, summer of this year. Basically, nothing happened this spring. And secondly, more importantly, it implies an optimism that I think is misplaced. Yes, there's potential for good news, particularly in Syria and Iran, but there's also the potential, as Dr. Brook pointed out, of the Islamists taking a giant step forward. I think it's too early to predict. So I call it the Middle East Upheavals, and indeed I think it was under my pressure that you changed the title of this panel from Arab Spring to Middle East Upheavals. I think it's far more neutral, and also includes Iran, potentially. So let's keep an eye on it. I don't think we know yet where this is going.
I agree. I mean, I never used the term spring either. And there is a big question, really, if a real civil society is developing. I mean, assuming it is, so then, yes, it will be a very significant event in Middle Eastern history. But personally, again, when I look at it from a long-term perspective, I think I share Yaron Brook's prognosis. I think basically Islam has been around for too long to enable a major transformation of societies over such, in the final account, short period of time without undergoing the major processes the Western democracies went of secularization, separation of state and church and so on and so forth. So, yes, so there are certain Western type elements in the Arab world, people who study in the West, maybe go back, bring some ideas. Many of them, by the way, bring radical ideas. I mean, I taught quite a few Egyptians in London who were in London because under the Mubarak regime they would have probably been in jail or executed. And then they got Western education, they take what they want, they pick what they want, they go back. But they are a small part of it. I think on the whole, Middle Eastern societies are far more religious than we want to acknowledge. And therefore, personally, I don't think a real spring is in the offing.
Those who studied in the West, I mean, many of the leading jihadi ideologues spent a lot of time in the West. But there is something ironic that those leading liberal or anti-jihadists have studied in the East. So, you know, Beirut universities, Cairo's universities produced many people who ended up in jail because they were rising against. So studying in the West is not anymore the measurement, but I take your point completely. In Washington and in Brussels, let's say in the West in general, we do have at least two camps when they look at those uprisings and try to analyze them. We have the over-optimistic but little informed elites who are, you know, looking at the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood-led movements and thinking that these are the liberals. I mean, outside this or a few other think tanks in town here, you know that most think tanks now think, that's why they call it the Arab Spring, that the Muslim Brotherhood are the revivalists. And that's why they are advising actually the administration, many members of Congress and many other governments in Europe that yes, this is an Arab Spring, simply because the Islamists, and I must say this, are very good, their strategists are very good at showing in the beginning of the uprising, oh, we're going to ta'addudiyya, pluralism and democracy. That's why it was mentioned in Libya that when the cameras were on, the organization, the Islamist organization was so disciplined that they imagined across Libya they had the same narrative. I mean, what does that mean? They never said anything beyond Nahnu Thuwar, we the revolutionaries, until they took Tripoli. The next day, Belhaj, the head commander of the military council in Tripoli, an Islamist leader, jihadist leader, said, I wouldn't go in any other direction than implementing Sharia law. So he came back to what he was. So things are not happening on their own. There is a very organized force, and that organized force is not just on the ground. It has a world of ideas, capacity. So we need to have a better view on that side of the Arab Spring. But there is another camp in the West, and I will have to make a point here that thinks that the Middle East really has not produced yet liberal and democratic forces, and with which I disagree. Those forces exist, they have not been successful, and there's a big difference. In Poland, you had the Solidarity movement. What Solidarity movement alone, against the might of the communists and of the Soviet occupation, it took many, many years. It took the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we could go back and forth. I am more optimistic in terms of reading the map. Those forces exist. I am pessimistic on the forces that exist in the West with regard to those issues. And here I join my colleague in stating that the elites which are shaping foreign policy on behalf of the West, on the one hand, are ignoring even those small-sized liberal democratic forces of all kinds, and oversizing the Islamist forces and presenting them as the actual alternative. So now if you look at one society, an average society in the Middle East, where there has been political violence before, you would see that, yes, somewhere between 5 to 15% are impacted by any Islamist kind of approach, Wahhabi, Muslim Brotherhood, Deobandis, or Khomeinis and others. But 15% is huge. 15% could put you on the Tahrir Square. I'll go to the date. July 29. July 29, 1 million almost, 700,000 to 1 million Muslim Brotherhood and Salafists showed up. Why did they show up? Because basically that was the day they said it's going to go in our direction. And you've got to listen to the liberals and the anti-Islamists in Egypt complaining, but they're not organized. So you've got 5 to 10% of very much organized, and then maybe somewhere around 5% of organized labor unions, and actually disorganized labor unions and liberals and what have you, who, by the way, are not very clear as to how to move forward. And in between, you have a large mass of people. And the large mass of people, yes, when the Islamists would ring the bell, the ear is there. So the political culture has not yet moved in one direction, but I would say it all depends on how we in the international community we're going to act. If we have one or the other, it's going to shorten or make it longer for democratic forces to go up in that debate.
I think this is much more like California, where we have no seasons. So it's certainly not a spring. I think that, they might, so let's say there are 5% liberal forces in a place like Egypt, which sounds right. I think the problem is, and let's say the 10-15% that are really radical, committed Islamists. I think that the problem is that the 80% that are not, they don't hold an ideology, are much more inclined towards the religionist ideology than they are toward the liberal one. I think that is the real challenge that the liberals have. They've always been, in a sense, a 5%, particularly in Egypt, of that liberal. But the population who, in a democracy, would vote, I just don't see them abandoning the traditions and the tribalism and the collectivism all at once. And I think it's a false analogy to Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe went through that process of the Enlightenment. It went through it slower, and it went through it a little bit more. It was rougher than did Western Europe, but it went through that process. In a sense, so they had some roots to go to when, to overthrow communism. At least, Russia's a little trickier, but at least Poland and the Czech Republic and so on, they had real liberal roots there that were popular, that were widespread. Communism was imposed on them very much. And so I think it wasn't that hard, if you will. And it still took them, 50, 60, 70 years to do it, to overthrow the shackles of communism. Those roots don't exist in the Middle East. I mean, that's one of the great tragedies. And I think the great tragedy of 1914 is when the Arabs, we talked about sending kids to school in the West, when those Arab kids came to school in the West, they didn't learn the right stuff, right? They came in a kind of a post-enlightenment Western education, where they were taught socialism and fascism, and they took those good lessons back to the Ba'ath Party and to help establish. And today, when they come to the West, they're taught multiculturalism and how evil the U.S. is and how bad we are. So one of the great tragedies is that we don't export our ideology. We don't. We don't view ourselves as exceptionalist as we truly are. We're much more exceptionalist than I think even the Bush administration thought we were. We need to export that. We need to export the Western values and the Western ideas that truly made us great, and we need to be aggressive about that. Not militarily aggressive, ideologically aggressive. And that is the only way the Middle East will change, is that if it acknowledges that and accepts those ideas.
So if you have questions, we're happy to bring you to the discussion. Make your way to the mic, and I'll take your questions. Can you just speak into the mic so the audience online and here can hear you? Yes.
Yes, good afternoon. In the last couple of days, Leon Panetta predicted, I would like to call it a prediction, that a revolution in Iran is inevitable. This is certainly a first for the current administration to admit that the tide is not of reform, but actual revolution. What can the West do to help the liberal Democrats, the true Democrats in Iran? Because Iran, in my opinion, and maybe I'm biased, but that's the way it is, went through what's going on in the Arab world 30 years ago, and the parallels are uncanny. Today they call the 1979 revolution an Islamic revolution, when in reality it was a revolution against the Shah, and the Islamists took over and hijacked it. And I think we're seeing that happening in the Arab world today. So the theory is that the Iranians have been through political Islam have figured out that that's not the way they want to live, and the next time around, the likelihood of a true secular liberal democracy, is much more likely. So what can the West do to help those people, achieve that goal? Thank you.
And I'd like to piggyback onto that. So adding to that question, comment as well about your view of Iran as a threat. So there's definitely two dimensions. One is, will there be, is there prospects for the movement within Iran, and what do you think of Iran's role and ability to capitalize on developments right now? So anybody want to take that? Okay.
I'll just begin. There's no doubt about it, and maybe other members of the panel will discuss the national security implication and the importance of dealing with the regime on other grounds, nuclear and terrorism. I'll just address the issue of democratic or revolutionary movement in Iran. And I would say what the United States and its allies around the world, and even many other players in the international community, needs to do is exactly the opposite of what we are doing or not doing now. That would give you the agenda. And it doesn't mean only this administration, even the last few years of the previous administration, so I don't make any differences, in the sense that to, first of all, recognize and identify the opposition in Iran, the multiple type of opposition in Iran as a legitimate player. They don't exist in our books, we don't receive them in the White House, we don't receive them in the State Department in a way that is official, as we should do. Number two is to give them full support. And I'm sure that all of us remember in June 2009 how we actually missed the boat, huge boat of 1.5 million people on the streets, and we said we are not going to meddle. And we are meddling all over the Arab Spring with F-16s, and I agree we shouldn't be in the business of military interventions at all in Iran, and you may know better than I do. But to have an official U.S. policy of partnering with civil society in Iran, there are plenty of exiled forces. So the whole map should be different in the sense that supporting the rise of Iranian civil society, including its ethnic minorities, is probably the best way to even respond not just to the principle of helping the Iranians to change, but for our own national security. It merges national security and our values, should be seen as one policy in supporting the opposition in Iran.
Anyone want to add to that?
We should help the opposition. The opposition may not all be liberal Democrat. Indeed, that's a pretty high bar. But I think we should make tactical alliances with whoever in Iran is willing to work against the regime, and we should broadly help them all. We should not pick winners, but we should focus our attention on the opposition, which is substantial and growing.
Yes, I agree with all of that, and the opposite of what we're doing now is a good strategy. But I would add, because maybe I'm a little bit more radical, Iran, in my view, is the number one threat to the region. It's the number one threat to Israel. It potentially is a long-term threat. If there isn't a revolution, it's a huge threat to the United States. I believe that it is the U.S.'s responsibility to its own citizens, to the protection of our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to militarily intervene and make sure that Iran does not develop nuclear weapons. And if possible, eliminate that regime and hand it over to the opposition. That would even be better. Now, I know in a post-Iraq war, that is just not politically palatable. But that's because I think we blew it in Iraq, primarily because of the post getting rid of Saddam Hussein, what we did after that. But I am a strong believer that this country needs to defend itself. And if Iran is a threat, which I believe it is to us, and by the way, I'm against the intervention in Libya, I'm against almost any American intervention. But when there's a real threat, when somebody's threatening you and building nuclear weapons and saying they'll use them, then it's the responsibility of our leaders to protect us. And so I believe it should go one step beyond and actually be, militarily we should get rid of it.
I want to follow up on your comments, Dr. Pipe. So you said we shouldn't pick winners and we should support the opposition. I'm interested in, we're running short of time, so maybe if anyone wants to comment, you can do it in 30 seconds or a minute. What do you think of our policy so far? Because right now it seems like there are two camps. One says we're being totally inconsistent, we're doing one thing here, one thing there, and then another side that says, well, something similar to what you're saying, we should support any opposition, in fact.
Consistency in foreign policy is an attractive goal, But I don't think it's the priority. The more important thing is to look at U.S. national interests in each case and figure out what they are. And if they're not exactly consistent, if Bahrain and Egypt are not exactly consistent, well, so be it. I don't think we should be focused on some seminar-like foreign policy development. We should look at what our interests are and pursue them. In the case of Iran, I agree that we want to stop nuclear weapons, and I don't go so far as to wanting to change the regime. I think the Iranians themselves should do that, but I think we should have a multi-pronged approach which contrasts our views, our ideology, our outlook with that of the Iranian government, which supports the Iranian opposition, and which tells the Iranians loud and clear that if they do go ahead and weaponize their nuclear capabilities, then we will strike and strike hard.
Any further thoughts on this before we conclude? I'm afraid we're out of time for questions. I thank you, panel, and very enlightening. We'll be continuing with our panel in about 5 minutes if anybody wants to take a break. Thank you, gentlemen.